to welcome Professor Clare Ungerson to Kenton this evening. Truth to tell, I've been nagging Professor Ungerson for some time to come and speak to us in Kenton, and I'm delighted that she's circumstances are now that she's been able to come and do it. Professor Ungerson is a retired and much respected academic, and she's become the historian and the chronicler of the Kitchener camp story. Now, this story isn't perhaps as well known as it deserves to be. It's a remarkable story of salvation, of resourcefulness and hope, all of which set against the most terrible and fearful of contexts. Looking around the screens, I can see the meeting has attracted considerable interest, and I'm delighted to welcome participants from home and abroad who may not have joined us at any of our previous Zoom meetings. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to Kenton. I'm also delighted to welcome Stephen Malcolm, who's very much a moving spirit behind this whole arrangement of the Kitchener camp story. And also to welcome Stephen's wife, Barbara, who is making a return visit to Kenton. I remember her in the youth service at Kenton Shore, so you know, old acquaintances being renewed. We also have a lot of, I've noticed, participants we've just been noticing as they've been coming in, international participants. And just in case, possibly, international participants may not know who we are, let me just tell you that Kenton Synagogue is situated in northwest London, and at the top of the screen here you can see Rabbi Yehuda Black, who is the rabbi of our synagogue. Kenton Synagogue is a constituent member of what is known in the UK as the United Synagogue, the US. And the United Synagogue is a union of British Orthodox synagogues representing the Central Orthodox movement in Judaism. It has 62 congregations, 40,000 members, and the United Synagogue is the largest synagogue body in Europe. So for those of you who didn't know that, you know it now. Formalities are over. We're almost ready to begin. But before I do, I just one small request. I know that there are a number of Kitchener camp descendants participating tonight. And I wonder if you haven't already done so, if you wouldn't mind using the chat just to notify me. I'm Vivian and David. And if you'd be so kind as to tell me that you are a Kitchener descendant, and if you're not sort of local in the sense you don't live in the United Kingdom, if you could tell us that too, we'd be very grateful. Okay, enough from me. Claire, over to you.
Unmute. And now I'm going to go to share screen, and hopefully this is all going to work. Okay, let me just get the view sorted. Right. Yeah, the trouble is my cursor disappears. Anyway, thank you very much, David, for that very kind introduction. And it's absolutely terrific that all these Kitchener descendants from across the world have come to attend a talk to Kenton Shul. And it's wonderful to see you all. I actually live in Sandwich. It's in many ways it's an accident and the result of living in East Kent for very many years, which is where Sandwich is located. I first came to East Kent in 1973, and I was appointed to the University of Kent, which is located in Canterbury, which is about 12 miles west of Sandwich. And when I first arrived, I asked around, you know, what's interesting around here, apart from Canterbury, which is, of course, a lovely place with an amazing cathedral and so on. And everybody said, oh, you must go and visit Sandwich. So I took myself off to Sandwich, and I wandered about this little town where I now live, which is a very exquisite medieval town, complete with a moat and medieval gates and a wall. And on one of the two still existing medieval gates, I found a plaque, which I now know had only very recently been put up. And it was put up on the inside of this gate. And this is a photo of the plaque, but I'm now going to move on a bit just to the words of the plaque. And this is what it says. This plaque is to commemorate the Richborough Transit Camp, 1939 to 40, where 5,000 men found refuge from Nazi persecution on the continent. During the Second World War, most of the men volunteered to fight for the Allied cause, erected in gratitude to the citizens of Sandwich and East Kent, who, as in the past, welcomed the refugees. And when I saw this, I thought, this is extraordinary. I don't know what this is about. I think those of us who have been brought up in households where the Holocaust, although it wasn't called that at the time, but the Holocaust was the deep background from which our parents came, we got used to hearing particular terms like gas chambers, Nazis, fascists, and so on. And I knew that I'd never heard of something called the Richborough Transit Camp. So that was the first puzzle. And the second puzzle was that it didn't mention that these refugees from Nazi persecution on the continent were Jews. And yet I thought they must have been. And why was it only men? That also seemed to me to be very strange. And having seen the plaque, I thought that's an interesting set of questions, but it's not my job to answer them. I'm not a professional historian. I'd been appointed to teach social policy, and this was many, many miles away from social policy, but I put that set of questions in my back pocket, as it were, and thought one day I'll find some way perhaps of answering them. And then 20 years later, I was appointed to be Professor of Social Policy at the University of Southampton. And some of you may know that at the University of Southampton, there's a very important, now world-class archive called the Parkes Archive, which is an archive devoted originally to Jewish-Christian relations. It was founded by an Anglican vicar in the 1920s who was particularly interested in Jewish-Christian relations. And he collected a lot of documents. And that archive has now, as I say, been developed and extended and is an international research centre called the Parkes Centre. Anyway, when I got to Southampton, I was instantly in touch with other Jews at the University of Southampton, mostly in the history department, people like David Cesarani, now sadly dead, and Tony Kushner, and other distinguished Jewish historians. And they asked me to join a committee. So I joined a committee. And is somebody chatting? I'm not sure.
Let me just mute everybody again. Hold on. Let me just.
Sorry.
Sorry, and that'll end up muting you. So,
okay.
So unmute yourself. There we are. There we go. Please unmute yourself. Claire, please unmute yourself. There you go. Please unmute yourself. Claire, you're muted. There we are. Oops.
That's it. Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's it. Wherever we left, we missed it a little bit. So
okay, right. So I was just talking about being at the University of Southampton, and I got the newsletter of the Parks Archive, and one day there was a reproduction of what clearly was a magazine that had been printed in the 1930s. And it mentioned the Empire Cinema sandwich. And I thought, this is it. And at the bottom of the page of that reproduction, it said the Kitchener Camp Review. And I thought, this must be something to do with this plaque, this mysterious plaque. So I decided at that point that once I was retired and could stop teaching and researching on social policy, I would make this search my own, as it were, and make it a retirement project. And then it was just a coincidence that we found, by this time I was married, a very nice house in Sandwich. So we moved to Sandwich. And the first thing I did when we'd unpacked all the boxes was go to Sandwich Archive. And there I found one or two documents, including a bound volume of the Kitchener Camp Review. And from that small beginning, I then went to the Wiener Library, where I got a great deal of archival information and some photos, which I'll show you later. The Imperial War Museum, where I found further stuff, and then eventually to an archive at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where I spent a lot of time looking at the papers of Norman Bentwich, who was extremely important in this story. So when I first came to this, I was really rather surprised that this had been an untold story, because, as you know, by the 1990s, 2000s, the literature on the Holocaust and on refugee policy was absolutely enormous. And yet somehow the Kitchener camp had slipped through and nobody really ever talked about it. Even in the histories of British refugee policy, it maybe got a paragraph at the most, or a couple of sentences. And that in books by distinguished historians. The reason why I thought it was particularly surprising was that we were talking about very large numbers of people. It wasn't, in fact, as I quickly discovered, 5,000 men who'd come to Kitchener on the edge of Sandwich. It was, in fact, 4,000. It's not comparable to the 10,000 lives that were saved, or just under 10,000 that were saved by the Kindertransport, but it's getting close to it. And what I later discovered when I started doing the archival research was that this rescue of these 4,000 men had exactly the same origins as the rescue that we now know as the Kindertransport, and was run by exactly the same people, and in many ways in exactly the same way. The trigger for both these rescues was Kristallnacht on, as I'm sure you all know, November the 9th, 1938, which was a pogrom of terrible dimensions. But one of the consequences, one of the after events of Kristallnacht, and again, this is not often spoken of, was that 30,000 men, no women, 30,000 men were arrested, Jewish men, and taken to 3 concentration camps, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, and Dachau. As I've said, this rescue to Kitchener was organized in exactly the same way. The men came on trains, not on special trains, but often in special carriages on trains. But instead of coming like the children did to The Hague and then to Harwich, and from Harwich to Liverpool Street, which is why there's that wonderful statue outside Liverpool Street Station of the Kinder. These men came almost always via Ostend and then on a ferry to Dover. And Dover is about 16 miles away from Sandwich. The organization that ran both these rescues was called, it kept changing its name, but it finally landed up as the Central British Fund for German Jewry. And I always think of the Central British Fund, or the CBF, as I call it in the book that I wrote eventually, as the posh Jews, the gentleman Jewry, as it were, the Davidoff Goldsmiths, the Rothschilds, the Montefiore's, and also corporate Jewry of the 20th century, Marks and Spencer's, Unilever's, and Odeon Cinemas. They were extraordinary in the sense that they were both very optimistic and also used to taking risks. And they somehow felt they could do this. They could find the money, they had the organizational skills to run these two remarkable rescues. They also persuaded their equivalents in the United States, known as the Joint Distribution Committee, or as I discovered when I was doing research in Israel, the Joint, to provide a contribution to the costs of the first year of running the Kitchener camp, up to a maximum of $100,000 or 20%, whichever was the less. And I have to say they had some difficulty in extracting this money when they actually needed it from the Joint, but it did come eventually. What I should also stress is that there was no contribution from the British government, no financial contribution, no help with finding a suitable camp. And I get rather irritated by the annual publicity about the Kindertransports, where it often seems to be implied that the Kindertransports was a rescue that was funded and organized by the British government. Nothing of the kind. Both these rescues were funded and organized by the CBF. What the British government did was it allowed both rescues to happen. They accepted that the visa arrangements, which had allowed probably about 60,000 German refugees into the country by then anyway, by 1939, that the visa arrangements whereby people had to be guaranteed by somebody living here that they would not call on the British state for financial support. The British government accepted that the Central British Fund was in fact the guarantor, the financial guarantor for all these refugees that were going to come. But they laid down two conditions. First of all, that these refugees should not remain in this country. They should be in transit, which is why on the plaque it says the Richborough Transit Camp. And they said that these men should only really come for a maximum of a year. And that they had to be able to, if the men were to come, they should be in possession of documents and guarantees that they would be leaving this country within about a year. Also, just as is the case now with asylum seekers, they should not work in the conventional British economy. They were not allowed to work. So they would have to be financially supported from some other source, and in this particular case, the Central British Fund. The camp was an old First World War camp. Sandwich, during the First World War, had been a very important embarkation point for troops going to the trenches of Flanders and so on. And in fact, there were 7 First World War camps on the edge of Sandwich, and they were generically known as Richborough or Richborough Port, because they set off from Richborough Port. And one of these camps was called the Kitchener Camp, after Lord Kitchener, who had been Commander-in-Chief of the British forces during the First World War until I think he drowned in 1916, and he was replaced by Lord Haig, and there was another camp called the Haig Camp, which is also part of this story. But the Kitchener Camp had been bought by a local mining company after the First World War, and I think they must have bought it because there are mines in East Kent, or at least there used to be, really quite close by. And I think the mining company must have thought that it would be a very suitable place to house miners. But basically, they never used this camp. And by 1939, it had become pretty derelict. And when the Central British Fund approached them to rent this First World War camp, they couldn't have been more delighted because at long last they'd got a tenant. And they didn't charge a huge amount of rent, but it was a repairing lease, as it were. And the Central British Fund was responsible for getting the huts into reasonable, habitable condition. And it started as a refugee camp in February 1939. So we've got from November the 9th, 1938 to February 1939. The first kinder transport was, I think, December the 2nd, 1938. They worked at incredible speed, these men. They were really extraordinary. And I think we should be proud of them. And it continued as a refugee camp until the fall of France in May 1940. Now, the Central British Fund had its own criterion for selection, and they decided, first of all, that it should be for what they considered to be young men. And they identified them as aged 17 to 45. And the reason for the lowest age being 17 was because the oldest age for the kinder transport was 16. So you can see that they conceived of these 2 rescues as complementary. And the reason they set the age limit at 45 was because they believed, probably rightly, that given that these men were going to have to be in transit and move somewhere else, not stay in this country, that younger men were more desirable to the rest of the world than older men, and that younger men could be taught new skills which would be suitable for, say, Palestine or the developing countries in Africa and Latin America, which were the other places where they thought these men might go. And the other criterion that they used, or at least instructed the Jewish agencies in Berlin and Vienna who were going to do the main selection of these men, was that the men would have to demonstrate urgency, that they had to get out of Greater Germany very quickly. And that is why most of them seem to have come from the 3 concentration camps of Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and I'm having a Buchenwald. I occasionally have the odd senior moment. So the selection of the men was undertaken by 2 Jewish agencies, one in Berlin that had been established in 1933, and one in Vienna, which had been dissolved after the Anschluss in March 1938, but had been put back into place by Adolf Eichmann, who was running the ethnic cleansing policies in Austria after the Anschluss. And Eichmann was present throughout in Vienna, and he actually moved the Jewish agency, the Viennese Jewish agency, into the Rothschild Palace, which had been confiscated. And Eichmann's office was also in the Rothschild Palace. So Eichmann, on a weekly basis, demanded of the Jewish agency, known as the Israelitische Kultusgemeinde, on how many men or how many people, Jews, they'd managed to get rid of that week. And of course, he was not a good colleague, as you can imagine. He was a brutal man, as we know. Now, many men were chosen because they had skills which were appropriate for a derelict camp. So they were not your usual lawyers, doctors, and professors, university professors. They were plumbers and glaziers. They were people who had particular skills. I know that Peter Posner is here, and his father was selected because he was a typewriter mechanic. And they needed a typewriter mechanic because so much of the camp's communications were typed because they had to do mass communication. So men were selected with those kinds of skills, and also they wanted men who could teach skills because they realized that these men were going to have to offer themselves to the rest of the world if they were going to get 30,000 men out of the concentration camps, which is what, in a way, they hoped they would eventually be able to do. These men had to be moved on pretty quickly. So they had to be trained in skills which would be appropriate for emerging countries and for Palestine. The men, of course, had to leave their families, just like the children. And many of them left wives, children, and parents. And one of the things I found, it was quite difficult to get age data about the men, but I did find really quite a high proportion of unmarried men. So in certain respects, I think they were self-selected. They were not leaving wives and children, though many of them did, and I'll come to that later on. And as I've said, they came to England on trains via Ostend and arrived at Dover. Now, Sandwich, I don't know how many of you have been to Sandwich. I know some Kitchener descendants have, because we've had a number of events in Sandwich, in particular the unveiling of a plaque last September on the Bell Hotel, another plaque, a more accurate plaque that actually mentions that these were Jews. Those of you who don't know, Sandwich is a medieval town. It's said to be the finest complete medieval town in England. We have town walls, a moat, a quay, the Barbican Gate, on which the original plaque is still located. In the late 1930s, the population of Sandwich was just under 4,000. So we're talking about a proposal for a camp which was going to be about the size of Sandwich, on the edge of Sandwich. It's literally on the edge of Sandwich. You walk over a little bridge. It's a swing bridge, or it's often known as the toll bridge, because you used to have to pay a toll to cross it until quite recently. You walk over this little bridge, and on the left, pretty soon, within about 5 minutes, you're at the site of the Kitchener camp. Sandwich at the time was full of small shops, had 27 pubs and a weekly market on Thursdays, and it still has a weekly market on Thursdays. The one big excitement in Sandwich that had happened recently was that the Empire Cinema had opened in 1938. And that was very important for the people of Sandwich. But Sandwich is a rather strange place as well. It's by a golf course, the Royal St. George's, and the other golf course, there are two, is called the Prince's Golf Course. And you get a sense, the clue is in the names, that these are golf courses that are used by, still used, Prince Andrew is a frequent visitor to Royal St. George's by the royal family. And in the summer, very posh people come to stay, still come to stay in Sandwich. But at that time in the 1930s, there was a huge estate being developed called the Sandwich Bay Estate, not a council estate, an estate of fantasy houses, French chateau, enormous sort of Palladian palaces. And people like Waldorf and Nancy Astor, Harold and Dorothy Macmillan, the Prince of Wales, his mistress before Mrs. Simpson was called Mrs. Frida Dudley Ward, and she always rented a house on the Sandwich Bay Estate, and he always came to stay with her there. And one of the most important people, the first person to have a house on the Sandwich Bay Estate, which was built shortly after the First World War, was Captain Robert Gordon Canning. And Captain Robert Gordon Canning was best friends with Oswald Mosley, the leader of the British Union of Fascists. In fact, in 1939, they'd fallen out over money, but Captain Robert Gordon Canning had been Oswald Mosley's best man when Mosley married. Originally, her name was Diana Mitford. By that time, when he married her, she was Diana Guinness, but she divorced her Guinness. And she married Oswald Mosley in Goebbels' house in Berlin. There were 6 people present. Hitler was one of them, and Captain Gordon Canning was the best man. So you have an idea of who he was. And he ran a journal called Action, and he was chair of the board of Action. And he was there living on the edge of Sandwich. There was another fascist, also rather important, living actually in Sandwich, who was called Lady Grace Pearson. And she was married, was the recent widow in 1939 of Sir Edward Pearson, who'd run Pearson's, which is still a FTSE 100 company. She was immensely rich, very beautiful, said by the son of her butler, who still lives in Sandwich, to have been one of Oswald Mosley's many mistresses. She was also the parliamentary candidate for the British Union of Fascists for Canterbury, which is why Mosley often came to stay with her. And she was chairman, or president rather, of the Sandwich Chamber of Commerce. Now I'm going to show you some photos of the Kitchener camp. Now most of these are taken from Phineas May's album, photo album, which is deposited in the Wiener Library. And I'll come to who Phineas was in a moment. So this photo indicates that it was an army camp, not a place of great attractiveness. And in the background, you can see there's a lake, and that is known as the Stonar Lake and is the old medieval harbour of Sandwich. Sandwich silted up, hence the golf courses, and having been the most important medieval port in England, once the silting started, it went into decline and this lake appeared, which, as I've said, is the old harbour, medieval harbour. Now the camp was run by 2 brothers, the May brothers, Jonas May and Phineas May. And Jonas May called himself Major May, not because he'd been a major in the First World War, he'd been too young, but because he was a major in the Jewish Lads Brigade. And that is why he and Phineas, who had also been very active in the Jewish Lads Brigade, were appointed. The Central British Fund seemed to think that if these 2 brothers had run summer camps for the Jewish lads, they would be appropriate to run a camp for some pretty traumatized and many thousands Jewish men. But they made a reasonable fist of it, I think. And this is Jonas, obviously in mufti, though he very often wore a sort of uniform, outside a hut at the camp. I presume his brother, Phineas, took the photo. And this is Phineas. Phineas called himself the Entertainments and Welfare Officer. He was much more interested in entertainments than welfare and got very fed up with all the problems that the men kept coming to him about. Of course, they had many problems. He's in this photo, he's in the uniform of the Pioneer Corps, which he and his brother joined in December 1939. I'll come to the Pioneer Corps a bit later on. Some of you may know Adrian Harris, who's Phineas's daughter. And Adrian's very active in the Kitchener Descendants group. That's when we were able to be active before lockdown and the pandemic and so on. This is, again, another photo from Phineas's photo album. And the regime of the camp was, although the British government had said, you can't work, in fact, the regime of the camp was work, 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 because these men had been selected to do the work, as you can see, of building drains, putting windows right, mending roofs, and doing all the work that's needed to put these basically derelict huts into habitable condition. This is obviously taken in the summer, but Phineas, the great thing about Phineas was that he kept a diary. He kept a daily diary, and I will forever be grateful to him. He must have spent at least 20 minutes every day writing his diary in his tiny, tiny handwriting. And he gave it to the Wiener Library, and it was just amazing for me when I opened it up and discovered this fantastic source. But the weather between February and April was just awful. But clearly it was rather better when this photo was taken. One of the ways in which the May brothers set about managing relations with Sandwich was to make certain that a great deal of business was created for Sandwich. So they employed local builders, and this is clearly a photograph of local builders at work on a roof. And they used local market gardeners. And at a dinner dance in February 1939, which was run by the Sandwich Chamber of Commerce, Jonas May made, I think, a brilliant speech where he, in front of Lady Pearson, the fascist, said they were going to use Sandwich businesses. They were going to use Sandwich coal merchants, Sandwich market gardeners, Sandwich builders, and so on. And I think that was a really clever move. Now, the huts were okay, but as you can see, the problem was privacy, none at all. In each hut, there were probably, I think it was about 84 men. And there was a partition halfway down, and you can see the partition at the back of this photo. So there were 42 men on one side and 42 on the other. And there is another photo, which I haven't got in this series, which has a notice on it, on this partition at the back, which says, England expects every man to do his duty. You are not Englishmen, but you must do your duty. So you get a sense that It wasn't Dachau, but it was pretty authoritarian. And as I say, it wasn't a one-star hotel, let alone, comfort, but it was safety. The camp flag was raised, I think it's March the 1st, 1939. And I'll just read you, if I can find it in my own version. Yes. Jonas, by the time the flag was raised, and of course one of the great things about it is that it's a national flag. It's not, the swastika had long replaced the national flags of Germany and Austria. By early March, there were really very few refugees there. There were only a handful, and you can see there are only a handful here. But Jonas gave this speech. We know what this flag means to you. It means freedom. Freedom that I hope will never be taken away from you again. Freedom that I hope will now be yours to the end of your days. When we have sent the flag up, we shall sing God Save the King. And I want you to sing it with all you've got in you and with all your heart, because our King represents the freedom which is so important to us all. And Phineas had rehearsed them in singing the national anthem, our national anthem. And he'd explained to them that, as he put in his diary, we must stand to attention when we sing it and remove our hats. And then he goes on, they then sang it, and I've never heard it with much more feeling. There were amenities at the camp. There was a library, and you can see another notice here, please keep quiet. They put an advert in the Jewish Chronicle for books. And one of the things that really made Phineas pretty angry was that the first lot of books, they asked for books in English, and he got many copies of the same book, all in German, and the title was When a Baby Comes. And as he says in his diary, he could think of something hardly less suitable for an all-male camp. There was chess. This chap on the right-hand side, slightly plump, his daughter, and I met his daughter, Stella Curzon. I don't know if any of you know her. She was quite elderly when I talked to her, but there were English lessons in the camp. They managed to get 87 volunteer English teachers. And this gentleman talked to his English teacher about his wife and little girl, whom he'd left behind in Vienna, and how worried he was about her. And his English teacher said, don't worry, we've got friends who need a domestic servant in London, and your wife can come through the domestic service visa scheme. And we already have a little German girl living with us, and we'd like her to have some company. So if you can arrange for your daughter to come here, we will house her. And Stella and her mother came from Vienna in mid-August 1939. And Stella was taken in by these three maiden ladies living in a village near Sandwich called Minster. She was 10 at the time, and she went to Minster Primary School. And Stella said to me that this was really amongst the happiest times of her life. And every Sunday, her father cycled out to see her in Minster. And in fact, there's another photo of Stella and her father at Dover Castle, obviously on a Sunday outing. So there were some families who managed to get back together again. Not very many, about 300 probably, but they were amongst the lucky ones. There was a theatre, and there was also a cinema. The cinema was an Odeon cinema provided by Oscar Deutsch. And I've been told that Odeon stands for Oscar Deutsch Entertains Our Nation. And he provided an Odeon cinema, which was supposed to show educational films, particularly about Australia, because it was expected that many of the men would go to Australia. But in fact, eventually there was a revolt against this, and they got conventional films and Donald Duck cartoons and so on. But the theatre was very important as part of managing Sandwich, relations with Sandwich again, because once a month from June onwards, there was a concert. The men put on a concert, and there was the conductor from the Radio Stuttgart Orchestra was one of the men. And all the men coming from Berlin had been instructed to bring a musical instrument. So there were a lot of musical instruments. And there were some very good concerts. And there's one old lady in Sandwich who remembers going to these concerts and how exciting it was. I mean, nothing like this happened in Sandwich. And up to 1,000 people used to come to these concerts. I always show this picture because there were inter-hut drama competitions, and I always show it just to remind people that there were no women in the camp. They went to the Ramsgate Carnival, and they used what they could. And you can see here are some of the instruments that they brought with them, the accordions and so on. These +4s, which some of the men are wearing, I'm a bit mystified by them. I don't know whether they brought them with them, whether this was something that their mothers in Vienna and Berlin and elsewhere thought young Englishmen wore. But anyway, a lot of them seem to wear these +4s. And what you can't see is along the side of the truck, it says, "Our thanks to England," and there are obviously jackbooted soldiers with bayonets, and they used a bunk bed, anyway, but you can see what they were trying to say. So, is this a happy story? When I first started it, I thought, of course, it's a happy story. I mean, who could argue with that? But there are clearly considerable downsides. First of all, so many of these men had been in concentration camps, so they were traumatized. These were not the death camps of the post-1942 so-called Jewish final solution camps, but the death rates in Dachau, Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen and other concentration camps was at least 15%. I mean, they were extremely brutal regimes. And these men had seen that, obviously, if not themselves being beaten up or frozen. There was madness in the camp, and there's a memoir in the Wiener Library from somebody called Peter Mansbacher, who changed his name from Fritz Mansbacher, who was a 17-year-old in the camp. And he worked in the first aid station. And he talks about madness. And I think there were at least 2 suicides. Reading between the lines in Phineas's diary, it's really quite difficult. It doesn't actually say they were suicides. And one of them was a suicide in Margate Lunatic Asylum. Of course, they'd left their families behind. And some of them, as I've already indicated, did manage to get their families back together again. But one of the things I found in Jerusalem was a list of 582 children, which had been drawn up in October 1939 in an effort to persuade the Home Office to let these children into this country. And the children's, they were all the children of men in the camp, and there were 582 of them. It lists their full names, their dates of birth, and their last known address. And I spent years looking for these children. And of course, the Holocaust was extremely bureaucratized, so it's not that difficult. I found, I think it's 289 of them on transports. And one of the things that you can do with the Shoah database, which is what I used, was you can search for people from the same address with the same name, surname. And very often I found somebody who was almost certainly those children's mother, somebody of the right age. So she would have been a wife of one of these Kitchener men. And very often they went on the same transport. Later, when after the outbreak of war on September the 3rd, the British government realized that there were 4,000 German-speaking people, men, living very close to the English Channel. So they put in place 7 tribunals to assess whether these were friendly or enemy aliens. And they decided that all of them were friendly aliens, bar 2. And I don't know quite what the problem was with 2. But that meant that in December 1939, the British government decided that these were very useful men and that they should be allowed, indeed encouraged, to join the British Army. Not the armed bit of the British Army, the unarmed bit of the British Army, and that's the Pioneer Corps. The Pioneer Corps does not have access normally to weaponry, but it's used for logistical purposes, getting stuff from A to B, and also doing things like helping the Royal Engineers build bridges, digging latrines, and so on. And all these men were encouraged to join the Pioneer Corps, and many of them did. Those that didn't, and I think there probably were about 600 of them, but I'm aware that Clare Weissenberg is amongst the audience, and I think Clare has a better idea about these numbers. But about 600 of them, I think, were later interned on the Isle of Man, and some of them went to Australia, some of them on the SS Dunera, which was a story of its own. The upside, well, there is an upside, of course. I interviewed some of the men. Some of them were still alive, 1 or 2 of them still are, when I was doing the research for this book. And I just got the sense that they had made a reasonable new life in this country. And even those that had lost their families had made new families, had other children, new wives, and so on. But what they really wanted to talk to me about was the huge contribution that they had made to the war effort, and in particular, the post-war war crimes process. Because I think, I can't be certain, but I certainly get the impression that the large majority went back to Germany after the war and helped with the war crimes process and the denazification process. And for them, that was hugely pleasurable and hugely significant. The other aspect to this is that it does seem to be the case that despite the presence of the fascists, those posh fascists in Sandwich, the relations with the people of Sandwich were generally good. And many of them made firm friendships which have gone down the generations. And although the Board of Deputies had done a piece of work in February 1939 to find out the extent of anti-Semitism in Sandwich, and had basically, in a 3-page report, said that there isn't very much apart from this woman, Lady Pearson. They came back in November 1939 and again said, there's no sign of anti-Semitism, there's no graffiti, there are no posters, there are no leaflets. So in that respect, I think actually this was a success, a mixed success, but a success. And it has been my pleasure to write this book and to talk to people about it. So that's the end of my talk. Oh, and you can get the book, incidentally, off Amazon. It's commercially published. You can order it from your local bookshop and they will get it for you. It's now in paperback and it's cheaper. Okay, that's it. So perhaps people could be unmuted.
Thank you.
Let's see what happens. Claire, you've got time for a few questions?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Before you do, I just want to endorse what Claire said about, maybe too modest to say about her book. This book is a really, really engaging and riveting read. One has to say that not every history book is like that, but this one certainly is. And if you have even a little bit of interest in this topic, it's money very well spent. Okay, do we, maybe if you have a question or a comment you'd like to make.
Get rid of sharing the screen.
You could use the chat.
I have to get rid of.
No, I'm telling you.
Yes.
No, she hasn't done it. That's it.
Okay, let's have a look.
No, you've got a chat.
David?
Okay, yeah, we've got a question. Somebody saying David.
Hi, Stephen Nelkin here.
Yeah, go on.
Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Claire. Lovely seeing you again, and lovely listening
very nice to see you.
And lovely listening to you yet again, etc. One point that you didn't mention, I think, today was something about sort of the Jewish life in the camp.
Yeah.
I just wonder whether maybe you could give some sort of background, some sort of idea about what happened.
Yes, yes. Well, Phineas was very keen on a Jewish life. And from the beginning, he led classes in Jewish history, Jewish theology, and so on. And quite early on, one of the refugees, they arranged to get a liberal rabbi from Vienna. And he came, and later they got an Orthodox rabbi, and I'm not sure, I think he came from London. Actually there were two synagogues on the camp, and they didn't get on, these two rabbis. I found a really furious correspondence between the two of them in Jerusalem. I made a positive decision not to use it because I just thought, who cares? So there were regular services. There was a huge Seder, for example. There are photos of it. There must have probably been 600 or 700 men there. There was a large Jewish community in Margate and many synagogues of different denomination there. There's now only one. But there was also a beautiful
synagogue still there. Oh, synagogue's still there.
Yes, there is. There's one. It's a Reform synagogue.
It's Reform. Was it Reform before?
And the Ramsgate Montefiore synagogue was used for a number of weddings, but there were also weddings at the camp. So there was, I think, a really, if people wanted to participate, there was a very full Jewish life.
En passant, it turns out the Orthodox rabbi in the camp was a Rabbi Broch.
Yes, that's it.
And Rabbi Isidore Broch has since discovered that Rabbi Isidore Broch went, when the camp was closed, and obviously Rabbi Broch needed a job, he went to live in Gateshead, and he worked for the Bonds Matzah company.
Oh.
As their supervisor. Of course, this was seasonal work, largely. And then when that folded, I think they were taken over by Raccoons, he moved to Bournemouth. They're not my interest around here. We went to Bournemouth, and he was a supervisor at one of the hotels, I think, a kashrut supervisor at one of the hotels in Bournemouth. And just by chance, I came across somebody who was either his daughter or his granddaughter, who's a lady who lives in Golders Green, so by chance. Okay. He died some years ago. He retired to Northwest London and passed away some years ago. Okay, so much for Rabbi that. Any further questions? Vivian?
I just wanted to ask Claire, firstly, the Ork boys also came. My father was joined the Pioneer Corps from Kitchener Camp, and my uncle came over with the Ork boys.
Yeah.
And he was at the camp for a short time.
Yeah.
Are they included in the number, the 4,000?
Yes, they are. Yes.
Yes, and then they went to Leeds.
Yes. 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 I should explain to people who don't know that there was a school in Berlin, a training school. I can't remember what ORT stands for, but anyway, the whole school came very, very late. But half of them were left behind in Holland, and half of them got to the Kitchener camp. So again, although the school, thank God that half of them got here, but half of them didn't.
Was that because the war broke out just as they were about to come?
Absolutely, they came so late. I think one lot managed to get a ferry on August the 29th or something. And of course,
they were younger, weren't they? I think my uncle was 16.
Yes, that's right.
Would have been the transport age.
Yes.
Claire, I have a question. My father played the violin, and I have a picture of him holding his violin and standing with several men. But I wondered if there is a photo of the orchestra.
Yes, there are photos. There are photos of the orchestra. There are photos of a concert, in fact.
Have you plugged it in?
Are they in your book, those photos?
No, they aren't.
Where have you plugged it in?
If you go to the Kitchener Camp website, you'll find lots and lots of photos. And there are photos there of musicians. And you need to look at the website and see whether you can recognize him.
Okay, will do. Thank you.
Thank you. Over here, yes, please. Patanda. Yeah.
Hello, Claire.
Hello, Daddy.
Hello there. Nice to see you. You're looking very well.
So are you.
I just want to say, I, as you know, I'm one of the Kitchener descendants.
Well, you're a Kitchener man.
I'm a Kitchener man, yes. Yeah. My father was one of those lucky 600 insofar as when he left Kitchener Camp at the end of December 1939, he had a job in Manchester and he was able to join my mother. And I got to Kitchener Camp at the age of two weeks short of 4 years old in September. I got there on the 2nd of September 1939 together with my mother, and war was declared the day later. We were absolutely shattered, my mother and I, and my father. We spent a few days in the camp hospital. That's one facility they had besides all the others. And my father decided the conditions were so terrible for women and children that he managed to borrow some money, and he paid for us to stay at a local B&B, because that was Sandwich, and Richmond was a holiday centre, and we spent two weeks there, and then back in the camp. And my mother and I left at the end of September to go to Manchester, where she had a job as a domestic. Either sadly or not sadly, I can't remember a thing about it.
No, you can't. But I should explain to people how it is that women and children did turn up at the camp eventually. What happened was that as we got closer and closer to war, the children from London were evacuated. A huge evacuation began because the expectation was, as soon as war broke out, that London would be bombed. And so landlords and landladies in Sandwich, some of whom were already housing wives and children of Kitchener men were instructed to evict them and replace them with children coming from London. And so I think it's probably about 200 wives and children were allowed into the Kitchener camp. And the Chief Constable of Kent was really alarmed by this. I don't know what he expected to happen, but he wrote to Norman Bentwich and said, Norman Bentwich, who was basically in charge of making certain that things went smoothly at the camp. And he wrote to him and said, what are you going to do about this? And Norman Bentwich wrote back, said, it's fine, we've put up a fence. and they're allowed to meet for an hour a day. And so that's what happened. And they were there for 2 or 3 weeks, but then they were moved on.
What are they doing?
Can I ask a question?
Please do.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Can I ask a question? David, can I ask a question?
Yes,
David, Morris Reich.
Yes,
yeah,
please.
can I ask a question?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I just want to ask this question. My father, I unfortunately didn't tell me as much as I would have liked to know now in history. My father tried twice. He was from Berlin, so was my mother. He tried to get across the border twice. He was in prison. And he said he only got out of Germany because his father was Polish. And apparently it's who your father was considered your nationality. He went to Kitchener camp and he was something about 20. And then he was interned in the Isle of Man. So I'm wondering, what was the criterion that, you know, he was just 20 years old. Why would he have been gone to the Isle of Man? And he said it was really a tough camp. It was very authoritarian compared to the Kitchener camp.
Right.
So what would be the criterion?
One of the criteria would have been that he hadn't joined the Pioneer Corps, but he was actually, I think, at age 20. I think the minimum age of the army was 21 at that time. So he would have just, I mean, you know, on May the 10th, when Churchill became Prime Minister, in 1940, he said, collar the lot. And the Kitchener camp was in the wrong place. I mean, from Dundee in the northeast Scotland, to somewhere in Dorset on the southwest coast, was a 25-mile sort of cordon sanitaire, within which aliens, even if they'd been defined as friendly aliens, were not supposed to live. There was total mystification as to how it was that France had fallen so rapidly. And the idea was that there must have been a fifth column. So, you know, to have all these Germans living close to the coast, and France is visible from Sandwich, it just seemed too dangerous. So that's why they would have been.
He was only about a year. I mean, I visited Berlin with him twice, and I saw the grave of my grandfather who died in Sachsenhausen concentration camp in 1941. He lost 2 sisters and his parents, you know. And my mother, my uncle was in Auschwitz, and, you know, all family were wiped out.
Mm.
Can I ask a quick question or a comment? A couple of things. Good evening. I'm a Kitchener camp.
Yeah, just hang on for just 2 seconds. Just to remind everybody that if you're a Kitchener descendant, you haven't notified us. If you could please use the chat, just I'll be very grateful. Please go ahead with your question.
Well, it's not so much as a question as a couple of observations. Firstly, although Clare's book mentions 4,000, in fact, the quasi-census, the General Register of 1939, I traced just over 3,000 names. And that was taken, I think, on the 23rd or 29th of September. And included in those 3,019 were 160 females. So still at that time, there were ladies present there. Whether they were visiting there their husbands or hadn't yet left. I don't know, but
yes,
really there were, and possibly the discrepancy between or the General Register figure and Clare's figure is that the camp was, as she said, a transit camp, and clearly people did move.
Yes, they did.
During the time between February 1939 and so possibly even into after the war began. And we have no way of knowing from the records here who these people were and where they went. I mean, I know some members have put their details on the website and say, you know, their grandfather or father ended up in America or wherever else. But we have no way of knowing. We also can't tell, unless people put it on the website, where their parent or grandparent came from. Obviously, it's not just Berlin, it's the whole of Germany. I mean, my father came from Frankfurt. So that's another, unfortunately, it wasn't a proper census. It was really just the bare bones so the government knew what resources they had. And the other final observation is that the camp shut down in May 1940, and you either got turfed to the Isle of Man or possibly somewhere else, or you joined the Pioneer Corps. And in theory, you couldn't leave the camp before then. And yet I know my father went to London in January 1940, and quite why he did and how he did, I've never known.
No.
I'm not quite sure whether they were more liberal once the war had started.
I think so. I think things started to relax, and also Julian Layton replaced, because when Jonas May joined the Pioneer Corps, a large proportion of the camp became an army camp, a Pioneer Corps training camp. And the men who didn't join the Pioneer Corps were regarded as